August 16, 1997. A series of deafening explosions rippled across the Delaware River, tearing through the humid summer air. In a matter of seconds, massive brick walls that had stood for generations crumpled into towering plumes of gray dust. The ground violently shook as the RCA Victor plant in Camden, New Jersey, once the undisputed beating heart of American innovation, was systematically vaporized, leaving behind nothing but jagged concrete and an eerie, unnatural silence. Before the dynamite, there was the Empire. This was the original Silicon Valley, a sprawling titan of 40 buildings pulsing with the energy of over 30,000 workers. They didn't just build radios here, they forged the modern world. They birthed color television. They engineered military radar that turned the tide of war. They captured the voices of legends, dictating the soundtrack of the entire 20th century. Yet today, the deafening roar of those assembly lines has been entirely erased. The sprawling campus of innovation is gone, replaced by empty lots, chain-link fences, and the ghosts of a shattered working class. A global monopoly, reduced to rubble. How does the most dominant electronics corporation on Earth, an entity deemed too big, too essential to fail, end up orchestrating its own brutal execution in just a few short decades? How does an empire of sound fall so completely silent? The answer is not found in foreign competition or outdated technology. It is found in boardrooms. This is the story of the RCA Victor Camden plant, a story of staggering American ambition and a devastating portrait of what happens when financial engineers evict the visionaries, leaving a city to pay the ultimate price. In the beginning, long before the concrete colossus devoured the New Jersey skyline, there was only the rhythmic, metallic clatter of a small machine shop and a man burdened by a peculiar obsession. The year was 1894. Eldridge Reeves Johnson, a quiet but fiercely driven machinist working out of a modest garage in Camden, was handed a crude, hand-cranked gramophone for repairs. It was a novelty item, a notoriously unreliable contraption that sounded less like a musical instrument and more like a dying parrot trapped inside a tin can. To most, it was a toy destined for the scrap heap. But where others heard screeching, abrasive noise, Johnson heard the muffled, embryonic whispers of an empire. He did not merely want to fix the machine, he wanted to capture the ephemeral soul of human sound, domesticate it, and press it into something immortal. Johnson applied his mechanical genius to the problem, successfully developing a spring-driven motor that maintained a constant, unwavering speed. No more frantic hand cranking. No more distorted, wavering pitches. By 1901, armed with his newly perfected motor and a relentless ambition, he founded the Victor Talking Machine Company. It was the genesis of an industrial leviathan that would fundamentally alter how humanity experienced music. Yet every mythological kingdom requires a crest, a symbol to signal its power to the masses. Victor found its emblem not in a fierce eagle or a majestic lion, but in a slightly confused, inquisitive terrier named Nipper. The company acquired the rights to a painting titled His Master's Voice, which depicted the small dog tilting his head, listening intently to the brass horn of a phonograph. It was a stroke of profound, almost humorous marketing genius, a quiet, emotional promise to the consumer that this mechanical sound was so breathtakingly lifelike, so imbued with the human spirit, that it could fool a loyal, grieving hound. Nipper would soon be immortalized in a towering 4-story stained glass window, gazing down upon the city of Camden like a benevolent, furry deity of the industrial age. As the world clamored for Victor phonographs and records, Johnson's ambition violently manifested in brick, steel, and mortar. The Camden plant did not just grow, it metastasized into a self-sustaining industrial organism, a veritable city within a city. By the 1920s, it had swallowed up blocks of the waterfront, expanding into a labyrinth of over 40 specialized domains encompassing millions of square feet. To walk through the wrought iron gates of the Victor plant was to have one's senses immediately hijacked by the sheer scale of human endeavor. It was an ecosystem entirely self-reliant. Down by the Delaware River, massive barges unloaded mountains of raw timber. In one quadrant, the sharp, earthy scent of mahogany and walnut hung thick in the air as legions of master craftsmen transformed the wood into elegant, acoustic-enhancing cabinets. These machines were not treated as mere electronics. They were crafted as fine, heirloom furniture. In another sector, the oppressive heat of the pressing rooms suffocated the air. Here, thousands of workers, drenched in sweat and coated in a fine layer of industrial dust, stamped hot shellac into the microscopic grooves that held the soaring tenor of Enrico Caruso and the fiery, rebellious jazz of the Roaring Twenties. It was a relentless, orchestrated symphony of labor. When the end-of-shift whistle blew, it sounded like the roar of a mechanized beast, and rivers of men and women poured out onto the streets. Generation after generation, fathers, daughters, grandfathers, and sons, tethered their livelihoods, their identities, and their civic pride to the turning of those shellac discs. Camden was no longer just a town. It was the undisputed capital of global sound. If you were a global superstar, a virtuoso, or a maestro, your pilgrimage inevitably led to the recording studios in Camden. The factory was a magical crucible where human breath and vibrating strings were transmuted into solid gold. They were not just manufacturing consumer goods, they were minting culture, bottling time, and distributing it across the globe. But the harsh mythology of industry dictates that no kingdom remains isolated, and no technology reigns supreme forever. By the late 1920s, a new, invisible magic was sweeping across the American landscape, moving faster than any delivery truck: the radio. It plucked music, news, and drama straight from the ether, offering endless entertainment without the need to ever buy a physical record. The Victor Talking Machine Company, the undisputed masters of the physical disc, suddenly looked dangerously vulnerable to these invisible waves. Enter David Sarnoff and the Radio Corporation of America. RCA was a beast of an entirely different nature, a high-tech, patent-hoarding conglomerate with aggressive, almost ruthless visions of wireless domination. In 1929, right on the precipice of the Great Depression, RCA executed a breathtaking corporate maneuver, swallowing the Victor Talking Machine Company for a staggering $154 million. It was not a hostile destruction, but rather the forging of an ultimate weapon. The acoustic perfection and manufacturing muscle of Victor were forcefully married to the electronic wizardry of RCA. As the ink dried on the contracts, the Camden plant ceased to be merely a factory of music. It was quietly transforming into the most formidable technological arsenal the world had ever seen. The golden age of the simple phonograph had concluded, but the reign of an untouchable global electronic monopoly had just begun. The acquisition of the Victor Talking Machine Company by the Radio Corporation of America in 1929 was not merely a change of corporate letterhead. It was a fundamental rewiring of the facility's DNA. RCA, under the iron-fisted leadership of David Sarnoff, was not interested in merely building acoustic furniture. Sarnoff was a visionary who perceived the future through the lens of electromagnetic waves and vacuum tubes. He looked at the sprawling, million-square-foot campus in Camden and saw the ultimate physical manifestation of his wireless dreams. Within a decade, the scent of varnished mahogany began to fade, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of soldering flux, ozone, and hot copper. This transformation was brutally accelerated by the outbreak of the Second World War. When the United States entered the global conflict in 1941, the American government effectively drafted the entirety of the nation's industrial base. The Camden plant ceased all production of consumer phonographs and civilian radios almost overnight. The towering brick buildings on the Delaware River were immediately locked down, surrounded by armed guards, barbed wire, and strict security protocols. Camden was no longer an entertainment manufacturer. It was a classified military citadel. Inside those heavily guarded walls, the factory floor underwent a radical metamorphosis. The assembly lines that once pressed shellac records were rapidly retooled to manufacture the nervous system of the Allied war machine. Camden's engineers and line workers, now overwhelmingly comprised of women, as the men shipped off to the European and Pacific theaters, began producing highly sensitive military communications equipment. They built the advanced sonar arrays that allowed Allied destroyers to hunt enemy submarines in the dark depths of the Atlantic. They manufactured the complex radar screens that warned of incoming air raids. They assembled the vital radio transceivers mounted in the cockpits of bomber planes and the hulls of Sherman tanks. The precision required for this new era of manufacturing was unprecedented. A faulty wire in a living room radio meant a family missed a broadcast. A faulty wire in a military altimeter meant a bomber crew plummeted from the sky. The Camden workforce adapted with astonishing speed, mastering the intricate microscopic soldering and assembly required for high-tech warfare. At its wartime peak, the plant was operating around the clock in grueling shifts, employing tens of thousands of workers who were driven by a potent mixture of patriotism and industrial pride. RCA Camden had proven it could mass-produce not just sound, but survival. When the war finally ended in 1945, the factory did not slow down. Instead, it pivoted its massive, newly refined technological arsenal toward a peacetime population desperate for a modern miracle: television. RCA had been experimenting with television before the war, but the post-war economic boom provided the perfect fertile ground for mass adoption. The Camden facility, supercharged by its wartime manufacturing upgrades, was uniquely positioned to dominate this nascent industry. In 1946, RCA introduced the 630-TS, the first mass-produced television set. It was a heavy, primitive box by modern standards, housing a small, glowing black and white cathode ray tube. But to the American public, it was pure magic. The demand was instantaneous and explosive. The Camden assembly lines roared back to life with a deafening intensity, churning out millions of these television sets. The city of Camden swelled alongside the company, bound by an invisible, unbreakable tether. To work at the RCA plant was to hold a golden ticket, a guarantee of a middle-class life, a pension, and a respected place in a thriving community. Entire neighborhoods were structured around the plant's shift whistles. Local diners, bars, and supply stores thrived on the endless river of RCA paychecks. The factory was not just located in the city. The factory was the city. By the dawn of the 1950s, RCA Camden was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the global electronics industry. The sprawling complex now encompassed nearly 40 massive buildings, a dense urban labyrinth of smokestacks, railway spurs, and multi-story brick fortresses. But David Sarnoff was not satisfied with black and white dominance. He was obsessed with the next impossible frontier: compatible color television. The race to develop a commercially viable color television system was a vicious, high-stakes war against rival network CBS. Sarnoff poured an astronomical sum, eventually totaling over $130 million, into research and development. The burden of turning this expensive laboratory theory into a mass-market reality fell squarely on the shoulders of the engineers and assembly line workers in Camden. Manufacturing a color cathode ray tube was an engineering nightmare. It required aligning 3 separate electron guns to perfectly hit millions of microscopic phosphor dots on a glass screen, all separated by a fragile metal shadow mask. The tolerances for error were virtually non-existent. Many industry experts believed it could not be mass-produced efficiently, but the Camden plant delivered. In 1954, RCA began rolling the CT100 color television sets off the line. It was a triumph of American industrial capability, cementing RCA's status as a technological god. The company controlled the patents, manufactured the components, built the televisions, and, through its ownership of the NBC network, broadcast the content that played on them. It was a closed loop of absolute dominance. However, it is a historical constant that the absolute peak of an empire is also the precise moment the seeds of its destruction take root. As the 1960s approached, the atmosphere within the corporate hierarchy began to shift. The sheer scale of RCA's success bred a dangerous, intoxicating arrogance. The executives sitting in their plush, mahogany-paneled offices in the RCA building at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York City began to view the Camden plant differently. For decades, the factory had been revered as the beating heart of the company, a place of blue-collar genius and vital engineering. Now, to the newly minted MBAs and financial strategists running the boardroom, Camden was simply viewed as a massive, reliable cash register. They looked at their market share and concluded that RCA was invincible. The brand name was so deeply etched into the American psyche that executives believed consumers would buy an RCA television simply because of the badge on the front, regardless of price or internal innovation. They believed the company had grown too big to fail. This hubris led to a fatal disconnect. The men making the decisions in New York were increasingly divorced from the physical reality of manufacturing in New Jersey. They stopped listening to the veteran engineers who warned that the assembly lines were aging. They ignored the quiet murmurs from the factory floor about inefficiencies and the rising cost of labor. Most dangerously, they stopped looking at the horizon. Because they were entirely consumed by their own domestic supremacy, the leadership at RCA failed to notice a quiet, disciplined industrial revolution taking shape across the Pacific, one that was preparing to challenge the very foundation of the Camden Empire. The tech arsenal was fully stocked, but the generals commanding it had stopped paying attention to the war. To understand the unraveling of a manufacturing giant, one must look closely at the precise moment its leaders stopped believing in the very thing they manufacture. For RCA, this fatal turning point did not happen on the factory floor in New Jersey. It happened 100 miles away, high inside the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Manhattan, during a profound shift in American corporate philosophy. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, a new, intoxicating religion was sweeping through Wall Street, the era of the conglomerate. Financial theorists began preaching that a corporation shouldn't just do one thing perfectly, it should do everything adequately. The prevailing wisdom dictated that true safety and endless growth lay in extreme diversification. If a company owned a portfolio of entirely unrelated businesses, an economic downturn in one sector would seamlessly be offset by profits in another. It was a strategy built purely on financial spreadsheets, entirely devoid of industrial passion. Under the guidance of David Sarnoff's son, Robert Sarnoff, who took the reins as CEO, RCA eagerly swallowed this new corporate doctrine. The executives in New York looked at their massive, world-dominating electronics division, anchored by the Camden plant, and saw only a cash cow. Instead of taking the immense profits generated by Camden's television and radio sales and reinvesting them into the next generation of electronics, leadership decided to take RCA on a relentless, bewildering shopping spree. Almost overnight, the company that had captured the human voice, built the world's first mass-market televisions, and engineered military radar began buying up an absurdly disjointed collection of brands. RCA acquired Hertz, the massive rental car agency. It purchased Random House, the prestigious book publisher. It bought Coronet, a company that manufactured household carpets. And in perhaps the most baffling pivot in corporate history, the technological titan acquired Banquet Foods, plunging headfirst into the business of manufacturing and distributing frozen TV dinners. On paper, to the newly minted MBAs running the corporation, the numbers looked spectacular. The sheer volume of revenue flowing in from rental cars, paperback books, and frozen fried chicken inflated the company's overall stock price. The annual reports painted a picture of an invincible, diversified American juggernaut. But this was a dangerous mirage. It was the conglomerate illusion. While the executives were busy celebrating their sprawling new empire, they were actively bleeding their core infrastructure dry. The immediate victim of this financial engineering was the RCA Victor plant in Camden. For decades, the factory had thrived on a simple, unspoken promise. The company would fund the bleeding edge of research and development, and the workers in Camden would turn those laboratory miracles into mass-produced reality. But a carpet manufacturer does not require a billion-dollar research laboratory. A frozen food company does not need thousands of highly skilled electronics technicians. As RCA's capital was aggressively diverted to maintain fleets of rental cars and market frozen dinners, the financial spigot feeding the Camden plant was quietly, but firmly, tightened. The brilliant electrical engineers working along the Delaware River suddenly found themselves fighting a losing battle against their own corporate accountants. When they submitted proposals to upgrade the aging assembly lines or requested funding to delve deeper into emerging experimental technologies, the answers from New York increasingly shifted from an enthusiastic yes to a bureaucratic we'll see. The equipment on the factory floors, much of it dating back to the wartime boom or the early days of color television, began to show its age. The relentless, deafening hum of progress that had defined the city for half a century started to lose its rhythm. This starvation of resources created a profound cultural shift within the company. For the first time in RCA's history, the men and women who actually built the products were subordinated to the men who merely counted the money. The engineers, who understood the intricate, fragile nature of technological supremacy, could see the stagnation setting in. They knew that in the electronics industry, standing still is equivalent to moving backward. But their warnings were dismissed as the grumblings of a localized workforce that couldn't see the big picture. The tragedy of the conglomerate era was not just the misallocation of funds, it was the loss of identity. RCA had stopped being an electronics pioneer and had become a mutual fund disguised as a corporation. The executives were too distracted by their sprawling, disconnected empire to notice that the foundation of their original castle was quietly fracturing. Inside the brick walls of Camden, a deep sense of vulnerability began to take root among the thousands of workers who walked through the gates every morning. They were still producing televisions and radios, but they were doing so with aging tools, under the banner of a company whose heart was no longer in the machine. And as the corporate leaders in New York remained blindly intoxicated by their own financial cleverness, they completely missed a massive, hyper-focused threat quietly gathering strength across the Pacific Ocean. A threat that was about to hit the weakened Camden plant with the force of a tidal wave. While the executives in Manhattan were busy reviewing the quarterly profit margins of rental cars and frozen poultry, a silent, relentless revolution was gathering strength across the Pacific. It did not arrive with the deafening roar of a military invasion, but rather with the quiet, efficient hum of a completely new technological paradigm. For half a century, the RCA Victor plant in Camden had been a temple dedicated to a specific kind of engineering, the vacuum tube. The entire sprawling complex, the miles of assembly lines, the specialized glass-blowing facilities, the heavy metal stamping presses, and the vast woodworking shops was meticulously designed to mass-produce large, heavy, and heat-generating electronics. An RCA television of the 1960s was a substantial piece of household furniture. It was housed in a thick wooden cabinet, powered by a glowing, fragile array of glass tubes that took time to warm up and frequently burned out. This was the American standard, and RCA was its undisputed king. But in Japan, a different philosophy was taking root. Unburdened by the massive legacy infrastructure of older technologies, Japanese electronics companies like Sony and Panasonic fully embraced a breakthrough that RCA's own scientists had helped pioneer, but its executives had failed to fully exploit: solid-state technology. The transistor changed everything. It was microscopic compared to a vacuum tube. It generated almost no heat. It required a fraction of the power. And most importantly, it was incredibly durable. Electronics no longer needed to be massive, fragile pieces of furniture. They could be sleek, portable, and fiercely reliable. At first, the leadership in New York dismissed the Japanese imports as cheap novelties. When the first small, solid-state pocket radios and portable televisions began appearing on American shelves, RCA's executives laughed them off. They believed the American consumer would always prefer the grand, cinematic experience of a massive RCA console sitting in the center of the living room. They assumed the RCA badge carried a mystical, impenetrable loyalty. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Asian wave did not start by attacking RCA's flagship products. It flooded the foundation of the market. Teenagers bought the cheap, unbreakable Japanese pocket radios. Families bought the small, portable Japanese televisions for their kitchens and bedrooms. And as they did, American consumers noticed something profoundly damaging to RCA's reputation. The Japanese products simply did not break. There was no need to call a repairman to replace a burnt-out tube. There was no waiting for the screen to slowly warm up and flicker to life. The quality was undeniable, and the prices were aggressively low. By the time Sony introduced the Trinitron color television in the late 1960s, a set that offered a noticeably brighter, sharper picture than anything rolling off the lines in New Jersey, the novelty had become a full-scale invasion. Japanese manufacturers began rapidly climbing the value chain, pushing directly into the living room market that RCA considered its divine right. Inside the brick walls of the Camden plant, the atmosphere shifted from frustration to a creeping, cold dread. The workers on the floor, the seasoned technicians and assembly line veterans, could see the writing on the wall long before the executives in New York acknowledged the threat. They bought the competitors' products, tore them apart on their workbenches, and stared in dismay at the elegant, minimalist circuitry inside. When RCA finally attempted to counterattack and pivot its own production towards solid-state technology, the brutal reality of their situation was exposed. The Camden plant was structurally obsolete. Because the corporate parent had starved the facility of modernization funds for a decade, the assembly lines were too old, too inflexible, and too heavily reliant on manual labor to compete. The Japanese factories were marvels of the new age, lean, heavily automated, and heavily subsidized, designed from the ground up for precision solid-state manufacturing. Camden, by contrast, was a dinosaur of the Industrial Revolution, trying to compete in the space age. The cost of manufacturing a television in New Jersey was astronomical compared to the factories in Tokyo or Osaka. The unionized American workers, who had fought for decades to secure fair wages and middle-class lives, suddenly found themselves priced out of the very industry they had helped create. The executives in New York demanded that Camden cut costs to match the Japanese prices, but it was an impossible mandate. You cannot trim the fat from a system that is fundamentally the wrong shape. The Camden plant was built to make wooden cabinets and glass tubes, not microscopic silicon circuits. The psychological blow was devastating. For generations, the men and women of Camden believed they were the best in the world. They had built the radars that won a world war. They had engineered the magic of color television. Now they were being fundamentally out-engineered, outpriced, and outmaneuvered by companies they had once dismissed. The steady, roaring river of RCA televisions flowing out of the factory gates began to slow to a trickle as warehouses filled with unsold inventory. The empire was officially under siege, and the defensive walls in Camden were already crumbling. By the mid-1970s, the atmosphere within the RCA boardroom had shifted from arrogant complacency to quiet, panicked desperation. The Asian wave had not just breached their defenses, it had severely eroded their market share and humiliated their brand. The executives in New York realized they desperately needed a technological moonshot, a revolutionary new product that would reaffirm their divine right as the undisputed kings of American electronics. They needed a miracle, and they decided to bet the entire future of the company on a project that, ironically, attempted to resurrect the ghosts of their past. The project was officially known as the Capacitance Electronic Disc, or CED, but it was heavily marketed to the public under the glamorous moniker Selectavision. In theory, it possessed a certain poetic symmetry. RCA Victor had built its foundational empire on the simple, mechanical act of a needle, dragging through the grooves of a vinyl phonograph record. Now, the company's elite scientists proposed doing the exact same thing but with moving pictures. The Selectavision was, essentially, a video phonograph. It utilized a microscopic diamond stylus to read incredibly dense, microscopic grooves pressed into a conductive vinyl disc. It was a staggering feat of mechanical engineering to cram 2 hours of video and audio onto a single 12-inch disc. The grooves had to be thousands of times thinner than a human hair, and the disc had to spin at an astonishing 450 revolutions per minute. The tolerances were so terrifyingly microscopic that a single particle of dust, a smudge of a fingerprint, or a microscopic fluctuation in humidity could completely destroy the playback. To protect this fragile miracle, the discs had to be permanently sealed inside thick plastic caddies, inserted directly into the machine, and mechanically extracted by the player itself. It was brilliant, it was beautiful, and it was an absolute engineering nightmare. The development of Selectavision became a black hole for RCA's resources. What was supposed to be a quick, revolutionary strike against their competitors turned into a brutal 15-year technological quagmire. The engineers struggled year after year to stabilize the fragile discs, to prevent the stylus from skipping, and to manufacture the conductive vinyl without massive failure rates. As the years dragged on, the project became an obsession for corporate leadership. They poured tens of millions, then hundreds of millions of dollars into the CED laboratories. Inside the aging brick walls of the Camden plant, the assembly line workers watched this massive transfer of wealth with growing dread. The factory floors were desperately in need of modernization to compete with the automated Japanese assembly lines. But every spare dollar was being funneled into the Selectavision gamble. The workers were essentially ordered to hold the line with outdated tools, while the executives chased a mechanical phantom. The company was starving its present to finance an increasingly delayed future. After 15 years of agonizing delays, technical setbacks, and a staggering $600 million in research and development costs, RCA finally pushed Selectavision onto the market in the spring of 1981. The company launched an aggressive multi-million-dollar marketing blitz, heralding the CED player as the ultimate evolution of home entertainment. But timing in the technology sector is a ruthless, unforgiving master. The executives in New York had spent a decade and a half polishing a mechanical marvel, completely ignoring the fundamental shift in consumer desires occurring right outside their boardroom windows. By the time Selectavision hit the shelves, the market had already been infiltrated by a completely different technology: magnetic videotape. Japanese companies like JVC and Sony had introduced the VHS and Betamax formats. These tape-based systems were initially more expensive than RCA's disc player, but they possessed one catastrophic advantage that rendered SelectaVision instantly obsolete. Tape could record. The RCA SelectaVision, with its brilliantly engineered diamond stylus and spinning vinyl disc, was a read-only format. It could only play the movies that RCA chose to press and sell. Consumers, however, had already tasted the intoxicating power of the VHS machine. They wanted to record their favorite television shows while they were at work. They wanted to film their children's birthdays with camcorders. They wanted control. RCA had built a magnificent $600 million monument to an era that had already passed. They had engineered a beautiful, complex dinosaur in the dawn of the magnetic age. The market's rejection was swift and brutal. Despite massive price cuts and desperate marketing campaigns, SelectaVision players languished on department store shelves. The heavily produced movie discs gathered dust in warehouses. The losses began to mount at a terrifying velocity, tearing a massive hole through the corporation's balance sheet. By early 1984, the reality could no longer be ignored. RCA abruptly pulled the plug on the SelectaVision project, officially cementing it as one of the most disastrous commercial failures in American corporate history. The $600 million write-off was a fatal wound. The conglomerate was hemorrhaging cash, its stock price was reeling, and Wall Street was demanding immediate, ruthless action to stop the bleeding. The executives needed to make a sacrifice to appease the market and save the corporate entity. They looked at their sprawling empire, searching for the heaviest, most expensive burden to amputate. Their gaze fell directly upon the Delaware River. The Camden plant, the massive, aging, unionized labyrinth of brick and steel that had birthed the company and sustained it for over 80 years, was no longer viewed as a sanctuary of innovation. To a terrified boardroom desperate to survive the SelectaVision fallout, the birthplace of the empire was simply a massive liability waiting to be severed. The decree was quietly drafted. The manufacturing heart of RCA was to be surgically removed. The death of a monolithic industrial complex rarely resembles a sudden, catastrophic explosion. Instead, it is an agonizing, protracted exsanguination. Following the catastrophic $600 million failure of the SelectaVision project, the executives in New York did not immediately shutter the Camden gates. That would have drawn too much attention and triggered a massive union revolt. Instead, they implemented a far more insidious strategy. They decided to slowly bleed the giant dry, department by department, assembly line by assembly line. The rumors began to circulate across the sprawling New Jersey campus in the cold winter months of 1984. Foremen stopped ordering surplus raw materials. Maintenance requests for aging manufacturing equipment were silently denied or indefinitely postponed. Then came the physical dismantling. Workers arriving for their early morning shifts would walk onto the floor to find empty, echoing spaces where heavy stamping presses and soldering stations had stood just the day before. The machinery was being systematically unbolted from the concrete foundations, loaded onto flatbed trucks under the cover of darkness, and shipped away. The destination of this equipment represented a brutal paradigm shift in the American industrial landscape. The corporate leadership had discovered a geographic loophole in the pursuit of maximum profitability. Just across the southern border, in the desert landscape of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, a new network of factories known as maquiladoras was rapidly expanding. Simultaneously, across the Pacific, manufacturing hubs in Taiwan were offering aggressive incentives. To the financial analysts staring at spreadsheets in Manhattan, the mathematics of survival were undeniable. In Camden, a unionized assembly line worker with a decade of experience, a pension plan, and health benefits cost the company a substantial hourly wage. In the newly established foreign facilities, laborers could be paid mere fractions of a dollar per hour, with zero regulatory oversight, no environmental restrictions, and no collective bargaining rights. The executives argued that this aggressive outsourcing was the only way to remain competitive against the flood of cheap Japanese imports. But to the men and women of Camden, it was a profound, unforgivable betrayal. The layoffs did not come as a single, merciful blow. They were executed in agonizing waves, creating an atmosphere of perpetual paranoia. Every Friday afternoon became an exercise in psychological terror. Supervisors would walk the line, tapping specific individuals on the shoulder, handing them manila envelopes containing their severance details. These were not transient employees. RCA Victor in Camden was a generational institution. It was incredibly common to find families where a grandfather had built wooden phonograph cabinets in the 1920s, a father had wired military radar during the Second World War, and a son had assembled color television tubes in the 1960s. Their sweat, their ingenuity, and their unquestioning loyalty had built the global empire that the boardroom was currently cannibalizing. Now men in their late 50s, who had dedicated 30 years of their lives to the company, found themselves carrying cardboard boxes of personal belongings through the front gates, completely stripped of their livelihoods and their dignity. As the corporate entity as aggressively relocated its heart to foreign shores, the physical reality of the Camden plant became a landscape of despair. By 1985, vast swaths of the once thriving million-square-foot campus were entirely abandoned. Heavy industrial padlocks secured the heavy steel doors of Building 17. Thick tarpaulins were draped over the remaining inactive conveyor belts like funeral shrouds. The deafening, orchestrated roar of human productivity, the metallic symphony that had defined the city for nearly a century, was replaced by an eerie, hollow silence. This corporate amputation sent a devastating shockwave through the surrounding city. For decades, the local economy had existed in a symbiotic relationship with the factory. When the factory bled, the city bled. The diners where workers ate their morning eggs and drank black coffee began to shutter. The local hardware stores, taverns, and clothing boutiques that relied entirely on the steady influx of RCA paychecks found themselves staring at empty cash registers. The tax base of the municipality evaporated almost overnight, plunging Camden into a severe economic depression that would soon manifest in skyrocketing crime rates and urban decay. Yet, perhaps the most cruel irony of all was the visual facade the company maintained. High above the deteriorating half-empty factory buildings, the iconic stained glass window of Nipper, the dog, still glowed warmly in the evening light. To the outside world, the corporate emblem projected an illusion of enduring strength and American acoustic dominance. But inside the brick walls, the soul of the company had already been packed into shipping containers and sent away. The engineers had been silenced, the workforce had been gutted, and the executives had traded an 80-year legacy of domestic innovation for the cheap, immediate relief of foreign labor. RCA was a hollowed-out shell, severely weakened, desperately treading water in a rapidly changing technological ocean. And in the ruthless ecosystem of corporate America, a bleeding, weakened giant immediately attracts the ultimate apex predators. In the unforgiving ecosystem of Wall Street, a severely wounded corporation does not receive sympathy. It attracts predators. By the end of 1985, the Radio Corporation of America was a bleeding leviathan. The catastrophic financial hemorrhage of the Selectivision project, combined with a decade of directionless conglomerate acquisitions and the brutal loss of market share to Asian competitors, had left the once invincible empire dangerously exposed. Its stock price was depressed, its corporate leadership was fractured, and its manufacturing heart in Camden was already half dismantled. Yet beneath the staggering debt and the aging infrastructure, RCA still possessed a crown jewel of immense, undeniable value: the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC. The television network was a cash-generating machine, and in the deregulated, aggressive financial climate of the 1980s that made RCA the ultimate target for a corporate takeover. The predator that finally circled the waters was not a foreign competitor looking to eliminate an American rival. It was a familiar neighbor, a peer from the very pantheon of American industrial royalty, General Electric. Under the command of its fiercely pragmatic CEO, Jack Welch, GE was undergoing its own radical transformation. Welch, who would later earn the ruthless moniker Neutron Jack for his habit of eliminating employees while leaving the buildings intact, operated under a brutally simple philosophy. He demanded that every division within General Electric be either number one or number two in its global market. If a business unit could not achieve total dominance, it was to be fixed, sold, or unceremoniously destroyed. In late 1985, GE announced a staggering $6.28 billion acquisition of RCA. At the time, it was the largest non-oil corporate merger in global history. When the news filtered down to the remaining workforce at the Camden plant, there was a brief, desperate surge of optimism. For the men and women who had watched their beloved company stumble under the incompetent leadership of financial engineers, the arrival of General Electric felt like a potential salvation. GE was a manufacturer. Thomas Edison had founded it. Surely, the workers reasoned, a company with such deep industrial roots would recognize the historical value of the RCA Victor plant. Surely GE would inject the necessary capital to modernize the assembly lines, push back against the foreign imports, and restore American electronics to its former glory. It was a devastatingly naive hope. Jack Welch did not look at RCA and see a storied pioneer of sound and vision. He looked at a spreadsheet. He saw NBC as a phenomenally profitable asset that perfectly aligned with GE's shift toward lucrative service industries. And when he looked at RCA's consumer electronics division, the sprawling, aging factories in Camden, the unionized workforce, the shrinking market share, he saw a massive, unacceptable liability. RCA was no longer number one or number two in the global electronics market. By Welch's rigid doctrine, that meant the manufacturing division had no right to exist. General Electric did not purchase RCA to save it. They purchased it to strip it for parts. The execution of the American electronics empire was swift, unsentimental, and breathtakingly efficient. Almost immediately after the ink dried on the merger in 1986, GE began the systematic dismemberment of the RCA carcass. The prestigious David Sarnoff Research Center, the laboratory that had birthed color television and countless military innovations, was unceremoniously donated to a third party to secure a tax write-off. The various disparate companies RCA had acquired during its conglomerate era, the carpet manufacturers, the book publishers, were swiftly liquidated. But the fatal blow, the ultimate betrayal, was reserved for the consumer electronics division. Jack Welch had zero intention of fighting a costly, protracted war against Japanese manufacturers over television sets. Within a year of the acquisition, GE brokered a massive deal with Thomson SA, a French state-owned electronics company. In a complex trade involving medical equipment, GE handed over the entirety of RCA's consumer electronics business to the French. For the Camden plant, this was the final death sentence. The American executioner had done what decades of foreign competition could not. It completely erased RCA as an independent manufacturer. General Electric simply licensed the iconic RCA name and the image of Nipper the dog to Thomson, reducing an 80-year legacy of profound technological innovation to a mere marketing sticker to be slapped onto foreign-made plastics. The remaining operations along the Delaware River were swiftly terminated. The last engineering departments were shuttered. The final assembly lines, which had already been reduced to a skeletal crew, were permanently powered down. The remaining workers, many of whom had held out hope that the GE merger would save their pensions and their city, were handed their final severance papers. There were no grand ceremonies honoring the men and women who had built the radar systems for World War II or the color tubes that defined the 1960s. There was only the harsh, metallic clang of the heavy iron gates locking for the last time. The psychological impact of this corporate execution was profound. The workforce had been prepared to fight a losing battle against superior foreign technology. What they were not prepared for was being sold out by their own. The realization that an American corporate giant would so easily sacrifice a foundational pillar of American manufacturing for the sake of quarterly earnings shattered the working-class illusion of corporate loyalty forever. The RCA Victor plant in Camden did not die because it forgot how to make televisions, or because the workers lost their skill. It died because in the new era of shareholder supremacy, it was simply more profitable to kill the company and sell its organs than to keep it alive. The City of Sound had finally been silenced, not by a bomb, but by a boardroom signature. When the heavy iron gates of the RCA Victor plant finally locked for the last time, the immediate sensation that washed over the city of Camden was not anger, but a profound, suffocating silence. For nearly a century, the acoustic heartbeat of the entire region had been dictated by the factory. The piercing shriek of the shift whistles, the rhythmic, seismic thud of heavy stamping presses, the endless rumble of supply trucks, and the chaotic, vibrant chatter of tens of thousands of workers spilling into the streets at the end of the day. These were the unmistakable sounds of a thriving American middle class. Now all of it was gone. The 40 colossal brick buildings that sat along the edge of the Delaware River were suddenly reduced to massive, hollow tombs of industry. The closure of the plant was not an isolated corporate event. It was the removal of a keystone from a fragile economic arch. The symbiotic relationship between RCA and Camden meant that when the corporation severed its ties, it effectively drained the lifeblood from the municipality. The economic shockwave radiated outward with devastating speed. The local diners, where line workers had eaten breakfast for 30 years, found their booths empty and were forced to board up their windows. The corner taverns that had hosted generations of shift-end celebrations poured their last beers. Hardware stores, clothing boutiques, and neighborhood grocers collapsed under the sudden, total evaporation of their customer base. Without the massive payroll of the consumer electronics division flowing through the local economy, the commercial arteries of Camden simply dried up. This catastrophic loss of commercial activity immediately decimated the city's tax base. The local government, suddenly starved of revenue, was forced to slash public services. Schools were underfunded, infrastructure maintenance was abandoned, and the police force was stretched to the breaking point. The men and women who had dedicated their entire adult lives to the pursuit of technological supremacy under the RCA banner found themselves adrift in a landscape that had no use for their highly specialized skills. A master glassblower who had spent 20 years crafting the delicate inner vacuum of a television tube could not simply transition to a new career in a service-based economy. They were stranded, casualties of a corporate paradigm shift that valued cheap foreign labor over domestic loyalty. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the city of Camden descended into a severe, protracted economic depression. The narrative of the city drastically mutated. It was no longer celebrated as the City of Sound, or the undeniable capital of American electronics. Instead, it became a grim, national cautionary tale about the darkest realities of the post-industrial age. The desperation born from systemic, generational unemployment provided fertile ground for an epidemic of poverty and crime. The streets that were once packed with proud, unionized machinists and engineers became dominated by the illicit economies of urban decay. Camden routinely found itself making national headlines, ranked among the poorest and most dangerous cities in the United States. A staggering, heartbreaking fall from grace for a community that had once been the envy of the manufacturing world. While the city struggled to survive, the physical remnants of the RCA empire became a massive, dangerous nuisance. The sprawling campus of abandoned brick fortresses attracted vandals, scrappers, and the unforgiving elements. The corporate entities that now controlled the real estate had no interest in preserving the history of a failed enterprise. The land, they determined, was more valuable empty than it was bearing the rotting monuments of the past. In the mid to late 1990s, the wrecking balls and demolition crews arrived. The systematic erasure of the RCA Victor plant began in earnest. Buildings that had housed the top-secret development of military radar, laboratories where the first compatible color television signal was perfected, and the sprawling floors where millions of phonographs were assembled. All of it was ruthlessly pulverized into dust and rubble. The explosive demolition clouds that rolled across the Delaware River were the final, physical manifestation of the boardroom decisions made a decade earlier. The executives who had chosen to bleed the giant dry, who had gambled hundreds of millions on failed technologies and ultimately sold the corporate soul to General Electric, did not have to live with the consequences of their actions. They remained insulated in their high-rise offices and gated communities, their stock options secured, and their golden parachutes deployed. The true devastating cost of maximizing shareholder value was paid entirely by the working class of Camden. The sprawling empty lots, surrounded by chain-link fences and overgrown weeds, stood as a brutal testament to the transactional nature of modern corporate finance. A corporation may build a city. It may define its culture and anchor its community for generations. But it owes that city nothing when the financial calculus no longer aligns. The profound silence of Camden was the ultimate tragic legacy of an empire that had forgotten how to listen to the people who built it. Out of the 40 colossal brick structures that once formed the undisputed capital of global sound, only a fractured silhouette remains on the Camden waterfront today. When the explosive dust of the 1990s demolition derbies finally settled and the rubble was hauled away, the wrecking crews had spared one primary monument, the iconic structure crowned by the towering 4-story stained glass window of Nipper the dog. For years, this isolated fortress stood as a hollow, decaying monolith, its broken windows staring blindly out at the Delaware River like the empty eyes of a fallen giant. But in the early 2000s, as urban developers began searching for unique waterfront real estate with historical character, this surviving structure underwent a surreal metamorphosis. The building was not resurrected to manufacture electronics. It was gutted, sandblasted, and reborn as the Victor, a sprawling complex of high-end, luxury loft apartments. The transformation is a masterpiece of profound historical irony. The vast, echoing factory floors where thousands of blue-collar workers once stood shoulder to shoulder, drenched in the heat of assembly and the sharp scent of soldering flux, have been meticulously subdivided by drywall. Today, those same spaces feature granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and premium hardwood floors. The massive, reinforced concrete pillars that once supported the tremendous weight of military-grade stamping presses now serve as chic, industrial-style architectural accents. The demographic of this reborn monument tells the final, unspoken chapter of the corporate exodus. The residents of the Victor are largely affluent commuters drawn by the sweeping, panoramic views of the Philadelphia skyline glowing just across the water. They park their vehicles in secure, gated garages and sleep peacefully within the thick, impenetrable walls of the former empire. Yet just beyond the manicured perimeter of this luxury complex, the reality of Camden remains starkly different. The city that was economically hollowed out by RCA's departure is still fighting a desperate, agonizing battle against the gravity of urban decay. The descendants of the master machinists, the glassblowers, and the union organizers who actually built the RCA legacy do not live in these high-end lofts. They remain navigating the generational fallout of an industrial betrayal, living in the shadow of a monument they have been entirely priced out of. The building has been saved, but the community it once sustained was left behind. This profound disconnect between the building's current luxury and the surrounding city's enduring struggle is the ultimate physical manifestation of RCA's final decades. And what of the corporate entity itself? The RCA name, once synonymous with American innovation, acoustic perfection, and military supremacy, was reduced to a wandering ghost. Traded, sold, and licensed among various foreign conglomerates over the decades, the three-letter badge was ultimately slapped onto cheap, imported electronics, a zombie brand possessing absolutely none of the engineering soul that defined its golden age. The brilliant minds who engineered the magic of compatible color television would not recognize the disposable plastic goods that bear their crest today. High above the luxury apartments, the stained glass nipper still illuminates the night sky. The loyal terrier continues to tilt his head, listening intently to the brass horn of a phonograph. But the master is long dead, quietly executed decades ago by his own accountants. The story of the RCA Victor Camden plant is not merely a nostalgic tragedy about a closed factory. It is a brutal, enduring lesson about the soul of industry. It exposes the fatal flaw of the conglomerate era, the arrogant, misguided belief that an enterprise can be sustained purely by financial engineering, divorced from a deep, unwavering passion for the product itself. When the executives in New York decided that a corporation was simply a portfolio of assets to be optimized, when they chose to invest their massive capital into rental cars, carpets, and frozen foods rather than the engineers standing on the Camden floor, they signed their own death warrant. They believed they could outsmart the global market with brilliant spreadsheets, but they fundamentally forgot how to build the future. By starving their core infrastructure to inflate their short-term stock price, they invited their competitors to conquer their territory. In the end, they lost their market dominance, they lost their independence, and they destroyed an entire American city. All that remains of the greatest technological arsenal of the 20th century is a luxury apartment building, a hollow licensing agreement, and a quiet, glowing dog, forever listening for a symphony that will never play again. 11. The story of the RCA Victor plant in Camden is, ultimately, a mirror held up to the evolution of modern capitalism. It forces observers to confront a vital, enduring question. What is a corporation actually worth when it stops making things and exists solely to move money? For the better part of a century, the men and women of New Jersey answered that question with their hands and their ingenuity. They physically built the tools that defined the modern era, from the first mass-produced phonographs to the complex radar systems that defended a nation. They understood a fundamental truth that the financial engineers eventually forgot. True, enduring innovation is not discovered in the sterile spreadsheets of a Manhattan boardroom. It is forged in the grease, the glass, and the agonizing trial and error of the factory floor. When leadership decided that their world-changing products were secondary to their profit margins, the empire's fate was sealed. The tragic collapse of this technological titan was not a failure of American labor, nor was it a sudden lack of engineering genius. It was a catastrophic failure of vision. It was the deliberate, calculated decision to sacrifice a foundational industry and the loyal community that sustained it for the illusion of short-term financial supremacy. They traded their future for a fleeting bump in quarterly earnings, and in doing so, they silenced an entire city. Today, as the global economy becomes increasingly dominated by digital abstractions, outsourced labor, and rapid corporate restructuring, the story of RCA Victor stands as a quiet, powerful warning. It serves as a reminder that the physical things a society builds matter, and the communities that build them matter even more. Because when an empire stops creating and begins only to consume, it is only a matter of time before it consumes itself. If this journey through the rise and fall of the City of Sound resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Share your thoughts on the true cost of corporate collapse in the trough pains, and until next time, keep looking beyond the surface of history.